Thank you very much, Hassan, for that very, very generous introduction. We can only ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to um, make those expectations that uh, people have of us, the Ummah, true. And we ask Allah to guide and bless and protect the Ummah in these turbulent, challenging, but at the same time, creative times. And my topic today is precisely about that. It's about deglobalization and what kind of challenges and opportunities that presents for the Muslim world. So let me begin, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In 2009, The Economist noted that contrary to the accepted dogma that globalization was irreversible, the integration of the world economy is in retreat on almost every front. In other words, the world is deglobalizing. As globalization has furthered the spread of Western, liberal, and consumerist culture and knowledge across the world, should we expect deglobalization to create genuine room for a renewal, restore the wisdom of ancient cultures, including, and most importantly for us, Islam, the truth from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And will it enable us to solve the problems of spiritual nihilism, inequality, oppression, and ecocide that the modern civilization is committing? Or would it be merely a superficial change, combining the worst aspects of modern hedonisms and traditional oppressions? If the rise and consolidation of autocratic capitalism and ethno-nationalism in the contemporary world are any intimations, the portents of deglobalization are ominous. Is deglobalization good, bad, or simply inevitable? What might be done about it? Adjusting to the new world order may be a matter of life and death for many peoples, ways of life, cultures, ideas, and institutions. Several bodies of scholarship, including that by historians, social scientists, political philosophers, economists, and most of all, a rejuvenated scholarship of Islam, will need to be engaged in order to answer this question. So what I offer today is by way of some preliminary provocations. No foresight is possible without hindsight, so I'm going to begin by looking a little bit at where we stand. We have no view of the future without the view of the past. So after nearly half a century of the fierce storm of globalization that caught the Muslim Ummah unawares and unprepared, the winds are beginning to change. Divided into the petty states of the colonizers had carved out to better control and exploit it, at the end of the Second World War, the Muslim world became a petri dish for various secular nationalist ideologies and a chessboard for superpowers, proxy wars over the following quarter of a century. Despite notable early efforts by leaders of the fledgling nation states, the Muslim nation states after the colonial period, like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, established in 1969, OIC, without a strong center leadership and shared vision of the Muslim world, the Muslim world found itself like a rudderless ship as Cold War politics gave way to neoliberal politics in the 1970s and 1980s. The new unipolar world order, which came to be known in the 1990s as globalization, now may be coming to a close, leaving the world with a different set of winners and losers than the one it then found. Apart from multinational corporations and economic and political elites in the global north, the winners include elites everywhere, and even sections of the middle classes in certain previously impoverished post-colonial nations, China and India, where deep moral and social rot nonetheless has accompanied economic modernization. Their relative success in exploiting the fruits of globalization was enabled by a few shared characteristics. These were, in other words, the winners of globalization, which has generally been a devastating era for the vast majority of people in the world, and certainly the Muslim world. The winners were large economies that had already developed stable and relatively strong, but not necessarily good or just, merely strong political institutions. Now, although Muslim countries by and large have not fared well in any respect, globalization nevertheless has been a blessing in disguise for certain Muslim populations. It interconnected different parts of the Muslim world, as well as enabled the emergence of sizable Muslim communities throughout the global north, of which we are a part ourselves. State-controlled nation media gave way to satellite and social media, facilitating deep recognition of the shared values and suffering among the Muslim masses, as well as the development of global Muslim discourses and debates. So globalization certainly has provided certain advantages and opportunities, of which, of course, we are partaking in one today. The economic and political forces, nevertheless, that facilitated these globalizing changes are now giving way to an emerging multipolar world, which is all but certain to reverse many key aspects of globalization. Will this change bring relief and honor to the community of the Blessed Prophet ﷺ, or will it further impoverish it, reversing the meager gains made thus far and aggravating the inequality and oppression? Let us first consider the phenomenon of globalization. The challenges of defining which globalization reflect on the difficulty of defining and detecting deglobalization. Introductory, in other words, you can't understand deglobalization until you understand globalization, but there are challenges in understanding what is globalization and when did it start. Introductory literature on globalization today identifies it as a historical phenomenon that has occurred in various interrupted phases. So the last two phases of globalization, namely the long 19th century ending in the 1930s, and then the more immediate phase starting in the 1980s, both have had deeply disruptive implications for much of the world. The former augured, if not comprised, Western Europe's colonial grasp, and the latter, the one that we may be at the heels of now, the latter was defined by the American world order, expressed in the form of global capitalism centered in the US. The concept of globalization remained deeply contested even when nearly everyone agreed that it was underway. Scholars widely disagree about whether it is a single process or a name for multiple processes, and about what those processes are. One core set of definitions converged on globalization as an intensification of worldwide social relations and the world market. So world market and social relations have become much more intense, much quicker, much more numerous. The term globalization was coined in the 1960s, but it took the world by storm in the 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in the wake of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union stepped into the vacuum left by the British and French colonial empires. That was the Cold War. with the US as the new hegemon and United Nations as the diplomatic arm of the new Pax Americana and the US dollar as the new standard of exchange. So globalization was a phase that came with the end of the Cold War and a total triumph, if you will, of the US or the capitalist world. The Cold War was widely understood as an ideological conflict between two versions of modernity. The Atlantic modernity, alternatively the early developers modernity, as opposed to late developers, that championed capitalism, and the ultra-modern reaction to that modernity, which arose in continental Europe, came to power in the form of the Soviet Union. So, if you will, the Marxism was ultra-modern. It wasn't a reaction of tradition, but rather a reaction of a critique of modernity against modern institutions. The Cold War was the era of politics over economics, even though these two poles are defined by their economic ideologies. It wasn't economy, but it was politics that determined the alliances. The nation state form, that is the political form, the nation state, consolidated throughout the world primarily because the victors of the Second World War judged underdevelopment and ideological rebellions to be the foremost threats to this new order. In other words, when we speak of the nation state, the nation state order and the nation state as if it has been a marker of modernity, as necessary for modernity and inevitable in modernity. In fact, scholars who look carefully at this stuff argue that it didn't really emerge until the Second World War. Most of the world was divided between empires before the Second World War, so just 60, 70 years. And even then, the nation state was undergirded by a world hegemon, or two hegemons and then one. And the point here I'm trying to make is that the nation state was not a natural development, and it may not be inevitable. It may not be irreversible. Now, a new multipolar era is reluctantly on the rise. Most economists, political scientists, commentators, geopoliticians recognize that and comment on that, and it's fairly, in fact, at this point, one could argue inevitable that China is on the rise, but who else and what else, that of course remains still to be seen. In liberal democracies of the global north, that is United States, most of European countries, Australia, ultra-nationalist politics has embraced the anti-globalist agenda for both economic and cultural reasons, and scored remarkable electoral victories from Donald Trump in Britain and elsewhere, whose effects are unlikely to be reversed. The alignment of white supremacy, economic nationalism, anti-immigration, and Islamophobia has created a tsunami of right-wing anti-globalism, which has overtaken the strong leftist anti-globalism that long produced deep economic, social, and ecological critiques of the phenomena unleashed by globalization. So what's interesting now is that anti-globalism has taken a right turn. It was a leftist project starting as early as 1990s, but more recently it has the left, the ultra left and ultra right agree on one thing, which is anti-globalism, for different reasons. Profoundly damaged by globalization, Muslim states stand on the brink of political collapse. On the one hand, repressive autocracies in the Muslim world show unprecedented and open disregard for the interests of their own populations and Muslims globally. On the other hand, Muslim minorities, of course, I'm generalizing a little bit, but not really hard to see that that remains the case for the most part. Muslim minorities elsewhere face increasing and unprecedented persecution. Renowned Israeli journalist and scholar Elizabeth Surkov summed up eloquently in a tweet in June 2020, which sort of made my heart bleed a little bit, because this is an Israeli journalist could recognize where we were at. 25 years after Srebrenica, Muslim lives, she wrote, Muslim lives have never been as devalued as they are now. Genocide in China, ethnic cleansing in Burma, repeated chemical attacks and extermination by torture in Syria. In 25 years, we will probably reflect on this era of unchecked impunity with horror. I don't know if we have the right to be as optimistic as she seems to be, but that remains to be seen. I think mostly it will depend on our actions. Okay. So to complicate, of course, a little bit globalization narrative and bring out how we got here. The stage was set during the Cold War, you said, when the two superpowers treated these nascent Muslim states as geopolitical chessboard. In consequence, Muslim countries were especially unprepared for the onslaught of global corporations looking for cheap labor and new markets. As local businesses were decimated, the windfall of profits from global business fell into the hands of the easily corruptible elite, constrained by weak or nearly non-existent national institutions. As big money consumed politics in most of the developed world, in the developing countries, global capitalism far more easily destroyed any semblance of political self-determination and fanned endless crony capitalism, exacerbating inequalities and igniting all kinds of old and new tribal conflicts. So this is, of course, happening all over the world, not merely in the Muslim countries, but Muslim countries tended to be among the worst hit by the rise of crony capitalism with globalization. Yet, among the unintended but world-transforming effects of this phase of globalization, which happened to coincide with the rise of the internet, was the mobility of labor, knowledge, and most of all, sensibilities and desires. So one of the very remarkable things, socially speaking, is that Muslim societies, large Muslim societies in South Asia and Arabia and the Arab world and the Middle East and elsewhere, that were colonized for a long time, they had been still relatively more insulated from immediate world, immediate cultural effects, immediate fashions in culture in the past while they were colonized, and they're compared to today when the reaction of Muslim society, and particularly the elite in Muslim societies, into social phenomena, for example, in the global West, is almost immediate. So you have 1 month, you will have some kind of rise of LGBTQ a protest in the West, and a few months later, you will see something similar happen in Muslim countries. And so this connectivity, of course, is a double-edged sword. Another instance of the unintended consequences of globalization is the phenomenon of Al Jazeera, not just the Al Jazeera, the news station itself, but the idea that this first semi-independent news channel based in the small fossil fuel-rich Emirates of Qatar, which hired former CNN and BBC journalists to revolutionize news in the Arab world, offered a global and relatively balanced coverage from a liberal globalist perspective, served with a side of open dialogue and debate, which was remarkably revolutionary in the Middle East in particular, along with critiques of regional autocracies and cultural conflicts. among other forces, the possibility of political criticism by citizens and often silenced voices reconfigured the political agency of ordinary people in the Arab world, and that, more than anything else, in my view, explains the Arab Uprisings of 2011. So this, if you look at this slide, it sort of just captures some of what I have talked about. The case that globalization has harmed rather than helped economic stability was made eloquently by Joseph Stiglitz, of course, who is a very important economist himself. In fact, he was in the room when globalization was being designed in the Clinton era and earlier. And he, for those of you who are interested in globalization, he has a series of, I think, 10 talks on YouTube where he summarizes what he thinks where globalization and a reaction against it stands today. And I think that he's very sober about it. And he effectively concludes that globalization failed in doing the one thing that it promised, which is that, yes, there may be inequality, but overall, the poor are going to get some part of that windfall. So the overall, they're going to be a little better off. And this remains a mythology that is perpetuated often by propagandists and sometimes well-placed demagogues, including Harvard's Steven Pinker and others who talk about how we know everybody's better now. But in fact, this is not the case. And these two books, one is Free Fall and the other is Globalization, Its Discontents, makes that case strongly. Now, Stiglitz doesn't argue against globalization, but rather that nearly all the checks and balances that were placed against the power of multinational corporations and capitalism failed, and sometimes they were designed to fail because, of course, politics is also deeply enmeshed in money. This is I hope you can see, I hope the writing is not too small, but if it is, do let me know. Oh, I'm so sorry. Somebody said the sound is not good. I should have seen this earlier. Let me know if I need to change something. Is the sound still not good? Are people still having trouble hearing me?
So I think, Dr. Anjum, your mic is fine now, yes. But
okay.
Dr. Anjum, in the top right corner of your PowerPoint slide, you have some sort of icon. Some like big block. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. It's gone now.
Okay. All right. So that was just the Zoom, in fact, that was covering it. Okay. So the UN report in 2020 shows, it concludes that rising inequality had created discontent, deepened political divides, and can lead to violent conflict. This was an important report that looked at the consequences overall, like, sort of big picture consequences of globalization, and it didn't come out as positive as people would have thought. And this is UN. This is, if you will, the globalist temple. The report says the backlash against globalization has been a key component of recent populist rhetoric in developing countries, in developed countries. And it's likely that inequality, together with labor market insecurity and other economic considerations, along with cultural and demographic factors, have all played a role in the rising of populism. As you know, there is, of course, a debate whether it is economy that explains the rise of nationalist politics, or whether it's culture. And the report, in fact, indicates that it's more culture than economy. So it makes a comment that says cultural backlash, a reaction by once dominant social groups to social and demographic changes, seems to be a better explanation if you look at the data than even economy. Now, what's interesting is that globalization has been critiqued both by conservatives and, as I said earlier, both by conservatives and those both who are moderate and who are ultra-right. Similarly, it's been critiqued deeply by ultra-left. It's only the mainstream and center-left, the Democratic Party, if you will, that remains the most committed globalist. The conservative critique comes in different versions. There is, of course, social conservatives who worry about loss of solidarity, destruction of communities, and if you are, okay, there's a comment that says, could I enlarge slide text? Oh, sorry, so that I cannot do, unfortunately. I don't think that will allow me to do that, but nonetheless, I'll try to read it. So the first group is social conservatives, who worry about the loss of community. And this, of course, has happened in Muslim countries, Muslim societies, as well as, developing and developed world elsewhere. An example of this kind of critique that goes back, in fact, to mid-20th century is communitarian philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre and Michael Sandel at Harvard, who talk about the loss of communitarian values in the developed world and how that's necessary to democracy. But of course, in the Muslim world and developing countries in general, the effect of this has been far greater in some ways. Smaller capitalists, also smaller businesses, they feel increasing alienation from the world market, and they also are critics of global capitalism. Then there is ethno-nationalist populism, and this is the one force that we have seen grow out of proportion over the last decade. Now, the leftist critique is a scene from the Battle of Seattle in 1999. In fact, I think there is a movie by that name as well. I haven't seen it, but this was what they were saying in 1999 about, what was being done with the right kind of rights that were being given to multinational corporations. Nearly everything has come true. Acceleration in production and consumption and globalization is the single greatest threat for factors fueling global warming. They were saying that, of course, much earlier. The dynamic of global capitalism are inherently ecologically disruptive. And this quote is taken from Walden Bello, who has this remarkable book, which I recommend, Capitalism's Last Stand. Walden Bello is a Filipino sociologist who is now, I think, in the US somewhere at a University Emeritus. And he's one of the most consistent critics of global capitalism in the name of communities in the third world. And he writes, deglobalized non-capitalist economic arrangements appear to be a key part of the solution to the challenge of climate change and other forms of environmental degradation. The kind of movement that Walden Bello represents, which unfortunately has been muffled by many things, including nationalism, ultra-right nationalism, as well as socially irresponsible leftism like LGBTQ movement that is obsessed with complete sort of sexual sort of promiscuity as the way to solve all the problems with the world, unfortunately has silenced the deeply moral voice of the ultra left that once was strong. And I think that it's important for us to make alliances as Muslims with that kind of left. Culture and religion also have been deeply influenced by globalization. Nearly every religion has been transformed. New, quote-unquote, fundamentalist or reactionary movements, once that were more exclusivist and hardline, were strengthened in every religion: Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism. everywhere, now, of course, unlike Islam, when of course this was happening in Islam earlier than elsewhere, and it was seen by many people, including most Muslim, by the way, talking heads, who were theologizing all these problems. So for them, it was a particular brand of Islam, or was something went wrong in Islam somewhere, or maybe it was in the Quran, or maybe it was a theologian that you could single out, or maybe say a Khattab or somebody, Maududi, or somebody else who was the problem. But of course, within only delayed only by a decade, you saw those problems in some ways in much worse form in, say, Hinduism and Judaism, and in Christianity. If you just go look at Eastern Europe, it's ready to explode because of Christian ultranationalism against Muslims and against each other, of course, Orthodox and Catholic and so on. All of this has been aggravated by globalization, but the whole entire 9/11 narrative focused the attention only on Islam, including Muslims and Muslim theologians, as I said, who misrecognized, misidentified, misdiagnosed the problem, and missed the opportunity to do something reasonable about it. To speak of these challenges of globalization, one common reaction that many intellectuals had was this jihad versus Macworld approach, right? This is particularly a book by Benjamin Barber, who is a sort of a secularist American political scientist, who saw in jihad and the global capitalism two forces that were opposed to the nation state. Jihad, he saw jihad as not the if you will, the just war theory of Islam, which is what it is, but rather as a hearkening back to tribalism, whereas Macworld represents to him, like McDonald's and World, which is global capitalism, represents a global capitalism. So one force, tribalism, is smaller than the nation state, and then global capitalism is bigger than the nation state. Both, in his view, were threatening the nation state, which in his view was necessary for good society and the kind of secularism that Europe has developed. So this was the narrative that people were fed, this, of course, was happening everywhere in almost every nation. All right, to think about the Macworld, the global capitalism, which ultimately has been the successful force. Jihad, rather, was merely a distraction. Ultimately, it was global capitalism that was defining the world and continues to do so. So what you have is the resistance today, which is a sort of a resistance to all these forces, global capitalism, that is eroded the nation state values, which themselves, of course, had eroded deeper, older religious values, now leads us to a new situation where critics of the system today, the leftist critics of the system, and leftist politics, which is very attractive to Muslims. American Congresswoman Ilhan Omar just tweeted how pleased she was that LGBTQ equality bill passed Congress that represents really the what today's resistance to global capitalism and to these large capitalist forces have become. And Muslims have completely happily joined that idea of the good, which is that this resistance to these unknown big globalist forces has become itself the only morality that today we can hold on to. There is, when I write here, no to Aristotle, no to God, meaning neither reason nor religion can constrain our desires. We have an enemy, and I'm speaking as we are, as the leftist and the left-leaning, that includes left-leaning academia as well as the leftist politics. And of course, we have talked enough, and there is really difficult to say that alt-right politics has very little attraction for Muslims, although even that is now changing. But the ultra-left has similarly co-opted much of Muslim young generation, because there is this moral indignance, more anger, rage against something. So on the left, it is against the big man, against the system, and on the right, the rage is against the breakdown of social values. And both of those things, those kinds of rages are in fact deeply justified. Unfortunately, the solution on both sides is extremely vapid, and it aggravates the problems that it tends to address. So where do we stand now in this struggle with global capitalism and globalization? I think that let's look at it more theoretically, and let's look at what scholars, political theorists, and philosophers were saying. And I'm going to present two examples. Francis Fukuyama, who famously wrote 1989 essay, The End of History and the Last Man, that later became a book. That represents the the leftist or center-leftist liberal capitalist worldview, which is that the history has ended, that there is no great ideological struggle left anymore, that the West has won, that the best way for human beings to live is through liberal, secular, capitalist democracy. And a couple years later, Samuel Huntington famously wrote a rebuttal of that thesis, which was called The Clash of Civilizations, an article in Atlantic, which was also later published as a book, where he argued that, in fact, liberal democracy has not won, and it's not winning. In fact, a liberal democracy is a Western idea, and that the rest of the world is turbulent, and it has deeper values that contradict the values of the market and free democracy, and of course, along with that, a privileging of individual over community that the West requires. Huntington, in some ways, saw from very bird's eye view, from sort of 10,000 feet, this is happening, but he also his own perspective, unfortunately, was too hawkish. So he only could see the West versus the rest perspective, rather than think of something else to do with these civilizational units that he has postulated. Another book that is not quite as famous, but I think that it does quite a good job of showing us what was happening, is Amy Chua's book on how free markets and democracy create ethnic conflicts throughout the world, where she shows that that the free markets are empowering, in fact, new minorities everywhere. So democracy favors majority, free markets favor minorities, and certain minorities become very powerful, whether it's Chinese or Malaysia or some groups elsewhere. It becomes easy for a majority to blame their suffering on a rising minority, and global market allows this to happen. Anyway, so there were many reasons that people were talking about why it is that globalization is creating, rather than a panacea, rather than a nostrum, a utopia that everything could, rather than a utopia of liberal democracy, we were seeing increasing conflicts. And even Francis Fukuyama, in his new book, which is more humbly titled Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, in 2018. So it's quite a change in a period of just 30 years. So liberal democracy is not about to take over the world. That it's very clear that those countries that did not listen to the West, they did not try to westernize, or rather that westernized selectively, and the westernization was guided by a strong bureaucracy like China and India, were far more successful in taking advantage of it in some ways, although both of them are now seeing an ultra-nationalist sort of ideology, which is becoming a really nefarious force in the world, and very harmful for minorities, particularly Muslims everywhere. But nonetheless, this is the world that globalization created. And the question 20 years into globalization remains, has Huntington won? Has Fukuyama lost? It seems that the answer is provisionally yes. In fact, that Huntington was right. The world, in fact, is made up of civilizations, that people have deeper values that are not, that do not change when their economic system or when their political system changes. And so Chinese capitalism, democracy is going to look Chinese because there are values that are much deeper, that go way back, that are far deeply rooted than these modernization attempts of a few decades or even part of a century. So that said, the question is, what does this mean for Muslims? And I think that's all I have to by way of slides. And what that means for Muslims today, in my view, is a simple, I think, challenge, which is that currently it seems very difficult to say that there is any kind of leadership, intellectual leadership, or certainly political leadership around the world that thinks about the Muslim world. But going forward, I think we are, we simply cannot continue the way things are in the Muslim world. That I believe that we are currently at really, really important juncture when an old world is coming to an end. Globalization is going to be reversed, but what comes next and the form of it will depend very much on our level of preparation as Muslim intellectuals. And I think that we ought to think about new ways of imagining the Muslim world, envisioning a unified Muslim world, and we ought not to be overly constrained by the current year-to-year or decade-to-decade politics. That if the new changes of deglobalization, and the part about why I think scholars when they argue about why deglobalization is happening, I actually skipped that part. But there are both technological, economic reasons as well as cultural reasons why regions are forming, right? So there's a Asian trade alliances are forming, as well as a cultural ranks are being closed. The place where this is, of course, happening, but in a very attenuated form, is in the Muslim world, because there are deep rifts and deep ideological rifts, despite the fact that there is greater cultural continuity and great cultural communication and commonality of a public sphere and aspirations, memories, desires in the Muslim world than say, for instance, in Europe, where European Union, although it has failed in some respects, but nonetheless, as an attempt, it was conceived in order to take advantage of the new challenges and new opportunities that globalization presents. And I think that something like that kind of reunification for the Muslim world is long overdue, and we should think about this the next few decades rather than the next few years as a political vision for the coming Muslim world. Thank you very much.